This next session could be a bit of a roller coaster, and we all have a ticket to ride. And if you didn't get any of the 5 music puns I put in there, then who on earth are you? Go and educate yourself on music history. But let's introduce our Fab Four, because they really are fab. Director of Media Partnerships, North America at Meta, Peter Hutton, joining us by video link. Chairman of Apex Capital, Luis Vicente. Co-CEO at ESL Gaming, Ralf Reichert. And founder at SportByFort Consulting, Ricardo Fort. Please also welcome our moderator, Director at The Athletic, Ed Malyon. Ed, little word of advice. These guys are a bit of a rowdy crowd at times. We've seen them in all sorts of different guises, so good luck to you keeping them under control. And Peter as well, joining us from North America. Good to see you, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Ed, take it away. Good luck.
I had a load of Beatles puns planned, but you've done all the greatest hits for me, David, so thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. We're going to have probably quite a meandering discussion around many topics, but I'm going to go first to North America, where Peter is joining us. We talked a little bit about how the pandemic has changed sports, and it's changed sports for everyone, for investors, for fans, for players. Your company, Peter, completely changed its name. Facebook, one of the most famous companies in the world, became Meta. So tell us a little bit about how Meta sees the future of sports as things change in a post-pandemic world.
Well, the first thing is it was quite a relief to have the name change, because we're clearly about so much more than just the Facebook app. But when you say you work for Facebook, people sort of think that's all you do. And so much of the effort that we're doing at the moment is focused on the Metaverse and trying to create a better way of engaging with content. Particularly looking at the Quest headsets and the VR experiences, but also looking at issues like, how do you get more value out of an NFT? How do you make it a more utility-based activity? So lots of things we're up to, but one of the things that I loved about the previous panel was listening to Brian Philpotts and Dave Roberts talk about an audience leaning in and being part of the content. And that, for me, is really the journey of the Metaverse. It's an active audience. It's someone who really feels engaged with what's going on. And you look at what's happening in Quest and the VR headsets at the moment, and so much of that links to gaming, using sports IP in a different way, but that feeling of presence, being part of an event. And I think that's a great sort of route for the future for us all.
You talk about gaming, and it would be remiss of me to not bring in Ralf at this point, but if you're looking at the changing face of sports, it is this interactivity of fans, how they can be involved, whether that's through tokenization, whether that's through VR, through feeling like they're in the stadium, whether that's through participating in games where the monetization has become this huge involvement of the players, whereas previously everyone was in their own tiny little kind of video capsule. So Ralf, how do you see these kind of different themes coming together through gaming and sport?
I mean, there's a bunch of ways to look at this, right? And I think restart, right? So it's a bunch of ways of looking about it. One is, if you go into it from a fan watch perspective, then it's about fan engagement, and Peter already tried to touch it. And their video games are, by far the most engaging one. And what Web3 kind of does, it creates a new platform where this type of video games, I would even call it, right, will happen and will give you, as a fan, a more long-term ownership-based engagement with it. What does it mean, right? I mean, it's all about it's a lot about digital ownership. Right now, if you play a video game, you might buy a shirt of your club, but actually you rent it. You don't own it. You're paying something, but the minute this is all going away, there's a new version of the game, or someone decides that this is the past. It's literally the past. And the digital ownership is probably the most far away piece of Web3, but it's by far the most important. And that will give you the opportunity to own your club shirt or your Content's 86 Maradona video from the panel before forever and infinitely. And if I look at my kids, they are growing up in a world where a digital item for them is probably more valuable than a physical item even, although it's factually not true yet. But it will be true in the future. And creating video games and some other fan engagement tools. But in the end of the day, it's mostly a game, and the best use case for collectibles is always a collectible game, a card game around it, and stuff like this. So we've actually seen most of those things in the past with video games, and I believe that it's just applying them to digital ownership in the future to sports.
And you assume that FIFA, which is obviously changing its name, is the biggest football game in the world. Do you think that there's a world where their position can be challenged by a new wave of games, or do you think that their continued adaptation that we've seen with Ultimate Team and their further monetization of fans is something that can keep them on top?
It's a good question, right? And I mean, we briefly touched this in our pre-discussion, but the video game FIFA has been a fantastic commercial success, right? I mean, Luis will know this much better, but it multiplied its revenues in the last 10 years, 3, 4x, however you look at it. But from an audience perspective, it kind of is flat, which, in the attention economy we're in, and that's the whole theme of all sports and all conferences, this is actually, a warning sign. And now with, it a little bit changing its course and going on a different brand, we'll see if that has an impact on the audience. So I'm coming from esports, right? And that is a growth industry, so I'm much more excited about growth than about monetization. Obviously, monetization is important, but it's really about in 10 years where, how many people will be part of this. And for the video game, which represents the biggest sport in the world, football, it needs to be 10 times bigger than it's now. So the question really is there a path, or will it continue to be monetizing better, but being flat, which ultimately would lead the way to something else taking it over, or it becoming irrelevant over time. And then there's a second piece, which we've talked about. It's not the core simulation of the game, but all the games around it. And Peter started to touch on it, and that is a different field, but it's commercially probably even more important. But from an audience perspective, the video simulation is the key to, the young audience. My son started caring about football because of a video game, not because of a stadium visit. That was the other way around.
I can see you nodding away there, Peter, in California. We've always talked about being on video games. You now thinking about living in video games?
Yeah, and I think that the digital identity is important to people as well. That sense of who are you in your digital universe, and that's a huge opportunity for sports brands. You look at games like Rezel Player in the and fascinating that you can learn to become a better soccer player, but you can share your spend with the club. So Man City, for example, you license a Man City shirt, you play in the Man City stadium, you become a better player, but you're linked back there as well. And as a fan, you can show who you are by wearing that club jersey. You can show who you are by showing your NFT behind you. That sense of digital identity as a fan, I think, is really important. And again, plenty to learn from gaming as we get there.
Probably more one for Luis or Ricardo here, but this sprawling world that we're creating in the metaverse around sport also creates more assets for commercialization. And I think there isn't a football club in the world that isn't already thinking about ways that they can drive more revenue from this. So I don't mind which one of you takes it, but how are you viewing kind of this increasing of possibilities in the commercial space around sport in a world that literally didn't exist 10 years ago?
Yeah, good to be with all of you. Always a pleasure to be part of the event and with my friends here. So there are a couple of different things. So I think that the first one is you have to think, before thinking about sports in the metaverse, you have to think about how commerce would play a role in the metaverse. Because at the end of the day, what the brands are trying to do is to sell more stuff. So if the metaverse is working and it's allowing transactions to happen, that's great. So brands will embrace it, and the assets that are created are going to be welcomed and part of what brands want to do. If that's not the case, being there for the sake of being there, it's going to be a fancy thing to do. It's going to be a gimmick. A lot of brands are already doing this. But if it doesn't lead to transactions, to deals, to commerce in general, it's going to be irrelevant. My hope is that the former is happening. I mean, it's a new way to sell, it's a new way to engage, it's a new way to, to talk to people and to sell stuff. And when that happens, sponsors are going to embrace it and are going to be part of it as they are with other assets in the real world.
And I'll add to that, I think. We also need to go back a little bit to understand as well where the potential is and what is happening, right? And I think for many years, we've been talking about the big community, of sports and, especially in football, which I'm convinced is the largest community in the world. Nobody ever managed to quantify it properly and qualify it properly. I'll say probably Peter sits on what is effectively the largest database of sports fans in the world, and is not a sports company, right? And it says a lot as well about how the industry has, in a way, delayed a lot, its maturity on the digital landscape, right? And as much we've been trying to be more digital, and everybody claims digital at the center, I think there's still a lot to be done. And I think today, this, in a way, construction that was made, about, sports and especially football, of having one stadium, that has 40,000 people, and that, has this, emotional blindness, so that basically connects everyone, is not basically reachable, by many of the world population, right? So, and we all know that sports, in a way, prefer to have a third party in the middle of his relationship with the end user. And this today, I think, on the digital world is a massive problem. And I believe a lot that Web3 can definitely provide tools, to fix this, if, everybody realizes it's a long-term journey. Because as well, unfortunately, there is not sometimes too much patience, in sports. And this is effectively something that goes against the industry. Everyone has a, short-term view rather than a long-term view, unfortunately. And I think Web3 can definitely be an ignition, and everything that also brings in terms of the democratization of access. Because I think once and for all, we need to look at a sports event, at a football event, as someone that actually can connect the entire world. And we know this from a World Cup final. By data, maybe that is not very accurate, but at least give us a clear principle that there is a massive part of the world population connected around that event. But I think monetization is definitely there, right? And with maturity, it will become probably, I think, the biggest engine of monetization in sports. But we need to be patient, and we need to build well the foundations.
Can I add one comment? Because we talked before, and Ralf mentioned about the development of the FIFA game in terms of growth of user base. And I just want to give a slightly different perspective on that. And because when you look, I think one of the problems that we have is that when you look from the gaming perspective, or the live event perspective, or the merchandising perspective, you can have different reads into what's happening in football. And I think if we step back and look as a fan to the world, the gaming in this case is one of the consumption formats of football. So if you look at overall consumption of football, is it growing or is it not growing? And football has been growing over the years. It would be great if every individual piece of the puzzle was also growing. But I think that if the gaming works as an entry point for, let's say, younger consumers, which is not exactly the case, but if young consumers start consuming a football club because of gaming, and that leads to a merchandise sale, that leads to attendance, that leads to more viewership, I mean, it plays a bigger role in the ecosystem of football than the gaming itself. The problem is that we continue, and I think this happens with FIFA too, looking at the sources of revenue in an individual, on a one-by-one basis. And I think that's the wrong thing to do. If you are looking at gaming as your best recruitment strategy, that should be treated very differently than if you look at it as a revenue source, which is from a gaming specific point of view. So I just want to say this, because when we talk about the FIFA game and what FIFA is trying to do, I think there are things that are not being considered in this discussion. So.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, there's this new world now where we talk backstage about how the pandemic has accelerated the adoption of certain things, and the example I use is QR codes, which existed before the pandemic, but people didn't know really what they were doing. And then it came a point where you couldn't order a meal in a restaurant unless you had one, and you had to use it. So we're coming out of the pandemic, and all of these kind of, I say, technological advancements or technological things have been thrust upon clubs. But there isn't broad agreement, it seems, in which path to go down for these teams when they're trying to decide, this is what we want to, and, are we using it as a recruiting tool, or are we using this as short-term cash? So how do you think this is going to play out in terms of the dueling strategies that we're going to see from the biggest clubs in the world and the smallest clubs in the world? And which are the most interesting projects that you see out there that excite you?
I think, if I can jump in, I think one of the key things for me is the idea that you're bringing people in, then how do you keep them in? How do you keep them interested? And for me, that's about feeling a community. And no matter what you use as the entry in for a fan, the way of hooking their engagement, then the key part of it is you need to build them in a community so that they stay and they become stickier, whether that be in groups like WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, but you have to build them in. And Ricardo made the great point about monetization and the way we go for headline monetization strategies. But the long term is, how do you make somebody feel part of what you're doing, feel part of a club? And also, how do you use your athletes, who are your best ambassadors, to do that? If you look at who follows who on social media and where's that engagement content at its best, it's with an athlete. You want the authentic story of an athlete, and you've got to try and draw a line that connects with that interest in an athlete to an engagement with the community around the athlete, around their club, around their league. And that for me is the journey. And thinking about not how you monetize as a league, but how you monetize as a community, and build something that's longer term and more solid.
An interesting challenge today in the younger generation, right? Because of course, the industry has a lot of issues, financial issues, unknown about their real community and the real potential of the business, because I always say that we only still scratching the surface of the real monetization of the sport, right? Because if you really look at the numbers, that's what actually data today is telling you. But I think the big fight between, a personalization and authenticity, and again, we're talking about the gaming world, and today actually one of the things I think is interesting to watch in the next years to come is traditional games like, EA, FIFA, Konami, which is all about authenticity, right? So you want to play as Cristiano Ronaldo. Again, you can also now be Ted Lasso and play Richmond, which, by the way, is an amazing, I think, amazing club, and is a real club. It exists in real life. Versus, I want to be the player. And my avatar, which is already my digital self, my digital personality, wants to become an influencer in the game. And actually, the interesting thing on this, dimension is not two extremes, it's actually things that can connect with each other, right? So if today you look at, the spectrum of an existing game like EA, FIFA, or you look at new games like Goals or Striker Z, it's definitely possible for someone to actually be an avatar and connect as an avatar to the real world, become an influencer, have his own social media page, and be, basically a virtual character in the game that has a real life existence. So I think there is a massive opportunity there. I think there is as well brands today that, and unfortunately I don't think it's the big brands, in the sport that are pushing the change, even if I think there is a lot of good work that comes from clubs like Paris Saint-Germain or Manchester City in terms of innovation. But sometimes small clubs like, Ibiza, for instance, being a good example, a destination, that everybody knows, an entertainment destination. So, which basically is using football, right, to push as well the value of entertainment and prove as well that, football is part of a much bigger industry, which is entertainment. And I think there is still so many original, different, strategies that you can bring. Como as well being a great example of established brand. And I think today, again, look, you see the potential of influencers, today. There is some interesting, community organized clubs, in amateur, leagues, which today can carry a bigger social media following than actually a first division club, in UK, or Premier League, or a La Liga club in Spain, right? And so we need to look at these opportunities and not be afraid of testing, experimenting, failing sometimes, but to get, to the right model.
I mean, a lot of the discussions are about what is the right, what is the right monetization, whatever. And what you said is, where's the fan? What about the fan or the player?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, every discussion actually should start with that. And even the history of social media was that a lot of stakeholders, industries, right, sports industry among them, had been, wary of being on Facebook back in the days, or Twitter, or whatever. Like, these guys are stealing my content. Actually, no, my users are there, my fans and players are there, so I should interact with them. I shouldn't, cannibalize my existing business too much, but I should go where my fans are. And video games are exactly the same, and the metaverse is not there yet because the users are not there. You guys are investing billions of dollars to create that infrastructure and own a piece of that and bring the audience there. But then the question is not if I should be there, but how, and how is a cost-effective way to start.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot of time the customer is forgotten, and that is amazing.
It's true.
When you're looking at, we're talking about the clubs having different strategies, and there's Crawley Town in the 4th tier of English football, where they've come along and said, this is how we're going to run the club with fan tokens, and that's part of the capitalization, but it's also part of the strategy for building that community. More clubs, it seems like, have changed hands in terms of ownership in the past 2 or 3 years than in the decade previous to that. So do you think that football is going to embrace an influx of new ideas now with these new ownership groups who maybe come from other sports, and we're seeing a lot with America, or just come from other industries than the traditional kind of finance and whatever? So do we think that that is going to initiate a sea change in how some of this is thought about, or do you think that ultimately the traditional ideas around football will prevail?
I think it will help the change, right? Again, you look, for instance, Serie A, an amazing league, for my generation was the best league, right, for many years. Then went on a decline. So, and today has actually a massive contingent of new owners, coming actually from United States, which definitely is a big cultural change and a big cultural shift, right? And basically, I think the combination of the vision and more, let's say, commitment to more advanced, forms of technology, focus on data, bringing strict business plans, and having, let's say, less spending, or more effective or more efficient spending on your resources. I think all of this is very important. Now, can this just on its own change, the industry to the right, approach? Maybe just on itself can't, but that's where the change starts, I think, for the next years. Now, what is important as well is to understand that, and help as well these owners understand, I'll say the challenges they are going to find on this side of the Atlantic, right? Because the fact that, you have phenomena like relegation and promotion doesn't definitely help. I think everybody has a clear idea there is an untapped value, but, they still not a very clear idea how to shift that. And definitely, you need a long-term commitment, right? I think today there is, in a way, it's beautiful because, fans today can become as well owners of clubs, athletes are becoming owners of clubs, and I think this generation definitely can do a big change. So today as well, there is this democratization capability, and this is amazing, but you need to have a long-term perspective, right? So if today I buy a new club, I will need to put a 10 years view on that, right? And I will have to have the patience that, unfortunately, the majority of owners don't have.
Yeah, I don't know if there is we talk a lot about the American owners coming to the UK and buying a lot of clubs to Italy and to other countries. But I think more important than the source of the money is the profile of the money. So when you if you have a billionaire that buys a club, that's okay, right? So there's no big difference between an American billionaire and a European billionaire. That's more or less the same, right? So it's a vanity purchase. I want to be associated with the club. I want to own this big brand that everybody knows about. And I'm going to lose money for the next 10 years, and the asset will appreciate, and in 10 years I'll sell it and make a lot of money, not caring too much about the losses every year. So that's one thing, but I think this is less important than the profile of the money. And when I say profile of money is when investors, when funds buy clubs, they have a very different view of what they want to achieve with that. So they are there to make money. They are looking at a club, at a distillery, at another industry with the same eyes of where can I make more money? And that can have a lot of implications for the future of the club, how the club is going to be managed. Are they going to invest in players, or they just want to, appreciate the asset for a couple of years and then sell the clubs quick? So I think this is more relevant. And it's very different because at some point you have a lot of Chinese money in Europe. Now you have a lot of American money in Europe, and the nationality, again, don't be distracted with nationality. Think about what these people are trying to do when they buy a big club. So a big club that is acquired by a billionaire may be as well managed, if not better, than the former owner. What we have to learn how to deal with is this idea of some owners that you can import success cases from other countries as they are to European football, because that can be not necessarily the best way of doing things.
And I think it's important point just the fans as well, right? Because we also need to once and for all let fans be part of the decision process in order that also we can understand better what is needed. But at the same time, as well, it's important that fans get actually the true information about clubs, right? Because today, if I'm a fan of a club, I would like two things that are in a way a paradox, right? I want the club to win and to beat the rival, of the same city or the street. But I also want that club to actually always buy all the players in the summer, right? So, and the two things are not necessarily going, side by side, and it's important to understand the financial limitations, right? Which is a problem, but is a solvable problem, right? Because there is a lot of projects of clubs that have to reduce costs and still are competitive and still are winning. But fans definitely need to understand what is the burden of being an owner as well, right? Because as a fan, I want to own my club, right? But I don't necessarily want to have the complexity of taking decisions, and having to find money, to keep the club going. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting challenges I'll see as well for the next years, as more fans get together with owners in a co-ownership situation, will be this educational, process.
Sorry,
I
Peter.
think it's a fascinating area. And I think one thing that we sometimes fall into the trap of is thinking that football can learn from the foreign owners without thinking actually it's a two-way story. And I'm fascinated by what's happening with the 49ers and Leeds United, where you've now got 49er fan groups meeting up at Leeds and watching the game together. And I think there's a lot that football can actually show to the rest of the world as well, in terms of loyalty, in terms of engagement, in terms of history and that passion for a club that maybe isn't as inbuilt in places that have franchises that can move cities. So I think, we can also give knowledge from the football industry. But one of the things that I really like about when we talk to some of the American franchise owners about getting involved in football is talking about the experience in the stadium and talking about how they can make that more engaging. And you see the investment in football stadia in the US, and the quality of the screens, the quality of the food and drink experience, the idea that you can order food and drink from your phone, those sort of things, and improving the fan experience in stadia. I think that's a really fascinating way of learning. And we talked a bit about, and on the previous panel, about the idea of a second screen device. I think we also have to deal with the reality that a second screen device is a reality in the stadia. And people are permanently looking down, looking up, looking at big screens. How do you build that into a better experience and keep your fan engaged at the same time?
That's actually something, I've been thinking about recently, Peter, with Todd Boehly coming into Chelsea. The conversations, I don't know if you saw them about, he proposed very, I think, jokingly, not seriously, an all-star game for the Premier League, which for calendar reasons, and I think Jurgen Klopp would freak out, but like it's not necessarily something that we have done in the UK, but these things should be talked about, should be discussed. There are things that are going to be feasible in the future that could come over from the American game in the same way, like you say, that the fan experience in America, as someone who lives in Chicago, I know you spent a lot of time in America, Ricardo, the fan experience tends to be better than any Premier League game I've ever been at. So on this two-way street of learning that we're talking about from other major sports properties, what do you think is the number one thing that we can expect to change over the next 5 to 10 years with an influx of owners from other sports?
I think definitely there's going to be a space for a long discussion about new competition formats, right? Because without getting into detail which ones, because nobody knows, but again, there is basically a clash of generations, right? So there is basically still a dominant generation, you know, between 40, 50, 60 years old, which is more traditional football fans. They don't want any change. They want still to see, you know, consume the product in the same way. There is a younger generation today that even if they are in a stadium, right, the 90 minutes, they will be doing 20 things, you know, some of them simultaneously. And we are not, let's say, the more aged group are not necessarily seeing this very clearly, right? So I say things today when you look, for instance, at the scope of mass participation and amateur sports, right? I think we see unbelievable great examples of some things that if people actually take a look, will say, oh, this is impossible, but actually they are happening. And today we see, for instance, what you know, the triathlon has done, you know, so we see what cycling, you know, has been doing, you see running, but we tend to forget that football is actually the largest mass participation sport in the world, right? So things like actually having, you know, fans, you know, of a certain club playing together against fans of other clubs, and we see, you know, already some of these interesting initiatives, you know, fans from a nation playing against fans of the other nation, right? So that there is today a lot of, you know, interesting possibilities. And there is also, you know, in a way, the absolute need to try to create new competition formats that maintains stability of the industry, right? So we cannot keep building just something where there is a super group, you know, of entities versus then, you know, other, you know, group that has, you know, struggles, you know, so much, you know, to compete. And the power of this, again, you see, for instance, what Ryan Reynolds is doing with Wrexham, right? So I remember Wrexham because they used to play FC Porto in a UEFA Cup many, many years ago, and they beat Porto, which was unexpected. But what he's doing just proves, again, what you can build, you know, by really bringing the power of entertainment, of communication, of a certain different kind of leadership. And now is an interesting discussion, as you know, in that league, you know, about the streaming, you know, of the games, right? Because the traditional industry don't want to basically have it. They still want to do the product, you know, the same way they were doing so many years ago. But now there is, you know, basically Wrexham has fans, you know, actually all over the world that actually want to see the game. The same thing with Crawley and Wogme United, right? So, and I think this kind of, and we mentioned Richmond as well, so these kind of projects are actually bringing, you know, this, you know, will to force and, you know, speed to force things. And I think that for me is a very important point. And then the other one, and I will pass then to Ralf on this, is how virtual, right, will be a thing together with real, right? And how basically, again, when we manage to reduce latency, which will happen, you know, and you can actually have a real-time experience and a real-time gamification of the experience, right? Where I can try to guess, okay, is the guy going to score the penalty with his left foot? Is the guy going to smile to the goalkeeper before he does it? So today this is impossible because, you know, we still have not fixed latency, but this will open a totally new opportunity for the new technology that we're talking for VR. And I was lucky enough to have seen already many events of now ESL Face It. And for me, I learn a lot, right? Because I see actually an audience that is committed, you know, without, you know, any interruption for 6 hours, right? So, which we say, okay, this will be impossible to do with Generation Z. They do it.
Yeah, it's, I mean, we're talking about attention all the time. It's all about attention and, you know, what is the best product to follow. And what people forget is that, Peter, you will know this better, but Meta is investing as much in AI content as much as they do in the Metaverse, right? So
Yeah,
Status quo. Già, che ora tieni la stessa.
I have two mics that aren't working.
Yeah.
You've been silent.
I think this is
Bigger
sabotage.
attention, and our attention gets, twice as hard. No, but it's all about attention, and the question is for me, how does sport, what's the role of sports in this? And the role of sports is actually sports. It's, it has to be entertainment and it has to be enriched. But I think, when I look at it, all these tries to make it more entertainment than sport are totally the wrong way. I think you couldn't be more wrong, right? So an all-star game might be a piece of the puzzle, but it actually doesn't make it a better sport. It makes it more entertainment. And what we did with esports is we doubled down on the sport. We try to make it as competitive as possible, have the best teams in the world, play against each other in a maximum authentic way, in the best possible piece, and not create crazy stories around it, right? They are part of it and enrich it, but it's really about the sport. It's about competition, who's best. That's the role of sports, that's the authenticity of it. And the minute you lose that and go away, I think you're done, because you're going to lose against AI content after all, and, not against anything else. So it's simple.
Just add something else to your question. And I think that we are closer to a moment of disruption in football mostly than in other sports than most people think. And the reason why I see this way is football, more than any other sport, is an industry of bullies. So if you can bully the other side, you will. A big club will bully its players. A big league will bully the other leagues and the clubs. A powerful player will say, no, agua, right? Because he can do this. He can bully the federation, he can bully the tournament. And there is only so much bullying people can deal with. So at some point, because today there is no shortage of money, so at some point, there will be money from different sources that will allow the bullied to break up with the status quo. And what I mean by that is, when you look at what's happening in golf, that's a good case, right? Live Golf versus the PGA. If all the players were happy with the PGA, they wouldn't jump ship, right? Then you have other tournaments in football that are popping up here and there. If the clubs were happy with what they were facing in their domestic leagues or in continental leagues, they wouldn't be considering doing things like a super league or something. So there is a sense of discomfort in a lot of players in the football industry that at some point they will break up with the status quo and do something different. We don't know what doing something different is, but that goes back to the responsibility of entities like FIFA, like UEFA, like CONMEBOL, mostly, because they have another problem to handle. Their problem is that they have two contradicting roles that they are trying to play. In one hand, they have to discipline, govern sport, football. And the other one, they are promoter of events. And these things, they don't go together because they are competing with other people and promoting events. So at some point, some clubs are going to say, you know what, I'm fine with that. I don't want to be part of FIFA, UEFA, you name it anymore. I'm going to just play with these other 5 clubs here. I'm going to do my thing. I mean, and that's going to be a disruption. Today, clubs, fans, they may not be very happy with the rules of the game, but there's nothing they can do about it. How many of you, I mean, I'm competing with your phones right now, right? Half of you have your phones in front of you, and you're double tasking. So how many of you can watch a 90-minute football match? I can't, even from my own team. It's really hard. But the rules of the game have been the rules of the game for, 100 and so years. So at some point, somebody needs to look at it and say, hey, we are losing relevancy. Our content is not as appealing as it used to be because people are consuming 15-second TikToks instead of 90-minute matches. So how football adapt to that? And if the organizers don't do something about it, the clubs will do with somebody else's money. And I think this is closer to happen than most people believe.
You saw my question coming, Ricardo, because I think we're in this space where I see it as innovation versus disruption. So a sport that you probably aren't familiar with that has innovated is cricket. In 2013, the English Cricket Board designed a new, shorter form of the game, and now it's the most lucrative and successful form of the game, probably to the detriment of some of the more traditionalist sorts. I was going to say golf. You know, there are plenty of sports which are going to be ripe for disruption if the model is not exactly perfect and doesn't serve all its stakeholders. So the question for these governing bodies is, can you innovate before someone else comes along and disrupts you? So would you like to tell us a little bit about what's happening in Brazil right now? I'm not too clued in. So that's a restructuring of the league, is that right?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not aware, so in many countries, in Latin America mostly, a lot of the football is managed by the federations, unlike Europe or North America, where independent organizations run the football leagues, so the Premier League or La Liga, etc. So in Brazil, the federation has been running the national football for a long time, and the clubs decided to do something different, to move closer to what the European governance model is, so independent management. So the clubs are in the process of doing this. Unlike other countries, that has been done with the support of the federation, so this is an easier transition. So what we see happening is a collaborative disruption in the case of Brazil, because you have all the parties, the broadcasters and the federation and the clubs working towards the same objective. But you know, in a world where sports assets are so valued and there's so few big things happening, this is one of them that is likely to have an impact in the international market, because you know, it's a big market, a lot of big teams. So chances are, in 10 years' time, when you look at the top 5 leagues in the world, one of the top 5 today are not going to be the top 5 anymore. There's a good chance that the MLS is going to play a role, the Brazilian League is going to play a role, and that is going to happen. And that's going to change a little bit the balance of global football. Well, just to start with the idea of, we refer to global football as this big 5 leagues in Europe. There is no such a thing as top 5 leagues in Europe, big 5 leagues in Europe. There's a Premier League. 5 minutes later, there's everybody else in Europe, and then you have other countries. But in 10 years, North America is going to be much bigger, MLS, Brazil, so you should be ready to and be more fluent to know what's happening in those other countries, because that's going to have a bigger impact in world football than it has today.
And
Ed, I want to leap in on something you said, because I thought it was very relevant, talking about the cricket and how the cricket world has changed. And one of the reasons why it's changing so fast is it's the players who are changing it. Because the organisations say, okay, we'll give this little window to T20 cricket, but we'll keep this for Test cricket. And they all try and control this new monster that they've given birth to in T20. But it's the players that are following the opportunity and following the money. And that's what's really changing the ecosystem. And again, to Ricardo's point, you know, you don't have a fixed position of these are the top 5 leagues. You have, where does the player want to go to? You know, what is the most interesting opportunity, financial or career-wise, for them? And that's why we can see the flexibility come.
the point as well, which pick up as well what Ricardo and Peter were saying. The difference here is you're starting to see good examples of associations, groups of clubs, you know, different players that actually decided to work together. Right? Because the problem in football, you know, the rivalry is so big on the pitch, right, that people cannot disconnect that rivalry when they talk off the pitch. And this has been a massive problem for not just now, for years, right? Because now the industry has actually to understand that working together is essential to win the battle, right? Because the fight for relevance is there, right? So it's happening in front of our eyes. And they need to sort it out while they can. And for instance, I coming from a small country in the world at the global scale, you know, Portugal. Portuguese league is as well one of the few leagues, you know, in Europe, and the only one in the top 10 that has not a centralized, you know, rights. And this is also an opportunity to build something together, and I'm gladly see finally the clubs working together towards that. So that's the destination, which is, I think, unbelievably important. And then, you know, phenomenon like what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Africa now with effectively a super league, and maybe that format will be exported into other continents, I think is important because we tend to forget as well the power of the diaspora communities, right? So there is Brazilians all over the world. There is African natives, you know, or living, you know, in so many different destinations, you know, in Europe. You know, there is a big population of Polish, you know, living in the United States, you know, and other nationalities. So it's definitely important that we can create products that resonate with them, right? And if you look at, you know, I always look at Africa, for instance, as maybe the superpower of football, right? And we know this from an athlete point of view already, but it's a massive community. And, you know, from where I see it probably as the most interested community about the sport. And you know, the spending, you know, of time, attention, I think beats any other, you know, continent. And now finally they have, you know, a competition that can actually become visible to all the African community living, you know, in all the continents, you know, around the planet. So I think it's a good test. The Brazilian league, I think, again, I'm a big fan of Brazilian football since I was a kid. I follow. I think now that finally people can understand the narrative, and especially younger generations, because let's not forget that we've not been doing a good job on finding ways of telling the history of football and the sport to the younger generations. For instance, I always speak with my friends and, you know, and ex-business partner Ronaldo, so Nazario, so for many years, about actually how the younger generation knows him, not because of the player he was and this amazing player he was, but actually because he's on the ultimate team of FIFA, right? So, and this definitely shows us that we need to find new ways to improve the narrative and the storytelling.
Guys, thank you very much for all of that. I didn't even realize the time had passed, but David...
Only just, don't worry,
He's been looming in a way, so I only can thank you all for joining and thank you all for your patience this afternoon.
Thank you, Ed. Give it up for the panel, please, everyone. Fantastic. Luis, Ralf, and Ricardo, and Ed, take your seats back in the auditorium. Thank you very much indeed for the fascinating conversation. You can come back. I'll allow it. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.